Single father gave his last coin to a stranger. Days later, she returned and his life changed. Jonathan Hayes had always believed that kindness was a currency more valuable than any minted coin. It was a cold evening when he tucked his daughter, Eliza, into her narrow bed in the drafty apartment above the old tailor shop he managed to keep afloat. She was 6, with a laugh that could soften the hardest heart and eyes that mirrored the ones he had once adored in her mother. Since cancer had stolen Clara from them, Jonathan had been both father and mother, striving each day to fill the absence with tenderness and hope. That evening, he had counted out the coins left in the small jar on the kitchen shelf, just enough for bread, milk, and perhaps a scrap of meat for tomorrow's supper. But as he stepped out into the dusk, he saw her, a young woman wrapped in a threadbare shawl, sitting on the curb with her hands covering her face. Her shoulders shook in silent sobs, though she tried to stifle them. Jonathan paused, feeling the pull of his own struggles urging him to keep walking. He could not afford to spare a penny, not with Eliza depending on him. Yet something in the way the woman cradled her grief struck him deeper than logic. He approached quietly and crouched beside her. "Miss, are you all right?" he asked, his voice hushed as though he might frighten her away. She lifted her face, and for an instant their eyes locked. Her gaze held such raw desperation it made his throat ache. I haven't eaten in 2 days," she whispered. Without thinking, he reached into his coat pocket and closed his fingers around the last coin he owned. He pressed it into her palm, ignoring the voice in his head that enumerated all the things it would not buy for Eliza. "Take this," he murmured. "Get yourself something warm to eat." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she tried to protest, but he shook his head firmly. Then he stood, inclined his head, and walked away before she could say another word. That night, as he tucked Eliza in, he wondered if he had done the right thing. She deserved better than the meager life he could provide, and now even tomorrow's breakfast was uncertain. Yet when she looked up at him with sleepy wonder and whispered, "Daddy, you're the best daddy in the world," he felt the invisible weight on his shoulders grow a little lighter. The next days blurred into the same quiet struggle. Waking before dawn to open the shop, patching old coats, stitching hems, hoping each customer would pay on time. He was mending a faded tweed jacket late one afternoon when the bell above the door rang softly. He looked up and saw her again, the woman from the street. But this time she wore a neat dress of deep blue wool, her hair brushed smooth, her eyes bright and purposeful. "Mr. Hayes," she began, voice steady though her hands trembled at her sides. "I came to find you. I had to." He rose slowly, puzzled. "I never told you my name. It's Evelyn, and I owe you more than you can possibly know." She stepped closer, pulling something from her bag, a white envelope, thick with folded papers. "You gave me your last coin," she continued. "You didn't ask who I was or what I had done. That night, I used it to buy a meal and the strength to call my family after years apart. My father he's not only alive, he is the owner of Moreland Holdings." Jonathan blinked. The name was familiar, one of the most prosperous companies in the city. "I told him everything," Evelyn said, her voice turning fervent. "How a stranger saved me when I had nothing left. He wants to meet you. But more importantly, he asked me to deliver this." She pressed the envelope into his hands. He hesitated, heart hammering. Slowly, he lifted the flap and pulled out a letter on heavy cream stationery. At first, the words blurred together. But as he read, comprehension dawned like sunrise over a dark field. Moreland Holdings was offering him a position, head of wardrobe and tailoring, a secure salary, benefits that would cover Eliza's schooling, even health insurance. His breath caught. His eyes stung. "I don't know what to say," he whispered hoarsely. Evelyn smiled then, and it was the most luminous expression he had ever seen. "Say you'll come meet my father tomorrow. He wants to thank you himself." Jonathan nodded, unable to speak. In that instant, he felt a shift in the very marrow of his life, a door opening he hadn't dared to believe existed. That evening, as he closed up the shop for what might be the last time, he walked the familiar rows of spools and bolts of fabric, each a testament to years of struggle. The thought of finally giving Eliza the childhood she deserved made him feel lighter than he had in all the long years since Clara's passing. He lifted his daughter into his arms when he arrived home, holding her close as he whispered promises of bright days ahead. And though the future was still unwritten, for the first time he felt sure that kindness, simple, uncalculated kindness, could indeed change everything. That night, sleep did not come easily. Jonathan lay awake in the quiet, listening to Eliza's soft breathing, feeling the letter in the pocket of his robe as though it might vanish if he let go. Again and again he read the words in his mind, hardly daring to trust them. He had no illusions about how the world worked. Men who had nothing were rarely offered something without strings attached. Yet Evelyn's sincerity had rung so true that it had silenced the doubts that usually crowded every corner of his mind. As dawn approached, he finally drifted into uneasy dreams filled with images of Clara smiling at him from across a sunlit field, her hair streaming like golden banners. He awoke to Eliza shaking his shoulder gently, her small voice filled with wonder. "Daddy, there's a lady downstairs. She brought a car." Blinking, he sat up and rubbed his eyes. Sunlight poured through the thin curtains, pooling in bright rectangles on the worn floorboards. He hadn't expected Evelyn to return so soon, nor had he ever imagined he would see a polished black town car parked in front of his humble building. When he came downstairs, he found her waiting in the entryway, looking as composed and gracious as she had the day before. "I thought I could take you to meet my father," she said. "And your daughter too, if you'd like. There's no reason she shouldn't come along." Jonathan hesitated. Eliza's small hand found his, her trusting gaze searching his face. He swallowed hard, feeling a peculiar combination of dread and fragile hope. "Yes," he said finally. "Let me just get her coat." He dressed Eliza in her warmest clothes, though the collar was frayed and the buttons mismatched. As he buttoned the last button, he felt a strange flicker of embarrassment. How shabby they must look to someone accustomed to wealth. But when he turned, Evelyn was watching them with a softness in her eyes that eased his discomfort. The drive across the city was quiet. Eliza pressed her nose to the window, marveling at every row of tall houses and well-kept parks. Jonathan studied Evelyn in the reflection of the glass, wondering what her story truly was, what pain had driven her to that curb on the night their paths had crossed. But he did not ask. They arrived at a townhouse that looked more like a private museum than a residence. A tall man with silver hair and a bearing of quiet authority stood waiting in the vestibule. When he saw them, he stepped forward and extended his hand. "Mr. Hayes," he said warmly, his voice deep and resonant. "I am Charles Moreland. I cannot possibly express my gratitude for what you did for my daughter." Jonathan shook his hand, unable to find words. "You didn't know who she was," Charles went on, his eyes steady and clear. "You didn't ask what she could do for you. You simply helped her. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Eliza clung shyly to Jonathan's leg, peeking up at the imposing stranger. Charles noticed and crouched down so his gaze was level with hers. "And you must be Eliza," he said, his voice gentle now. "I've heard you love stories." Her eyes widened. "I do," she whispered. "Then perhaps when your father and I talk, you can visit the library with Evelyn. There are many books I think you'd enjoy." Jonathan felt his throat tighten as he watched Eliza take Evelyn's outstretched hand and disappear down the hall. Charles motioned him into a drawing room, where sunlight spilled across polished wood and the scent of leather and old paper filled the air. "Please sit," Charles said. "I won't pretend to understand all you've endured, but I know the strength it takes to do right by your child when the world offers you so little in return." Jonathan looked down, trying to compose himself. "I've done what I could," he said quietly. "Sometimes it hasn't been enough." Charles shook his head slowly. "It was enough," he said. "It was more than enough. Which is why I'd like to offer you not just a job, but a fresh beginning. I want you to take the position in our company's tailoring division, overseeing all the uniforms and special commissions. I believe you have the skill and the honesty to bring something rare to that work." Jonathan's hands trembled on the arms of the chair. I don't know what to say," he stammered. "Say you'll consider it," Charles replied. "And take this for today." He handed over a smaller envelope. Jonathan opened it with numb fingers and saw not just cash, but also vouchers for groceries, clothing, and school supplies. "That's only to tide you over," Charles said firmly, as though anticipating any protest. "Your first paycheck would come in 2 weeks." Tears burned at the back of Jonathan's eyes. He had imagined so many futures, most of them bleak, all of them colored by the struggle to scrape by. Never had he imagined that a single moment of compassion would carry him here. From the hallway, he heard Eliza's laughter, clear as a bell, and Evelyn's voice reading aloud. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the sound fill the hollow spaces inside him. When he looked up again, he found Charles watching him with a solemn kindness. "There's no shame in accepting help," Charles said quietly. "Sometimes it takes more courage to do that than to go on alone." Jonathan drew a shaky breath and nodded, feeling the old ache in his heart finally ease its grip. Jonathan rose from the chair as if lifted by an invisible hand. For so long, his life had been measured in coins, in worry, in the silent calculations that determined whether Eliza would have milk or only water with her bread. Now the arithmetic had changed. It was not just the promise of a salary or a title. It was the validation that he had been seen, that decency was not a forgotten relic in the world. He followed Charles back into the hallway. Eliza looked up from a low velvet chair where she sat with Evelyn, a large book open across her lap. The sunlight caught the fine strands of her hair and turned them into a halo. For one piercing moment, he saw Clara there too, smiling at him through their daughter's bright eyes. His heart contracted with gratitude so sharp it nearly brought him to his knees. "Daddy," Eliza chirped, holding up the book. "Miss Evelyn says I can borrow this one." "You certainly can," Charles said, his deep voice warming as he watched her enthusiasm. "And there are many more waiting whenever you like." Evelyn closed the book gently and looked up at Jonathan. "You did something most people wouldn't have done," she said softly. "You reminded me that compassion can still be simple, without any price attached." Her father inclined his head in solemn agreement. "And you reminded me that I must not turn away from my own family when they are lost," he added. "It was your kindness that brought my daughter back to me." Jonathan tried to speak, but no words would come. He could only nod, feeling the tears finally spill over. Eliza slipped her hand into his, her small fingers curling with perfect trust. Outside, the day had brightened into the kind of golden afternoon that seemed to promise renewal. They walked out together, Charles and Evelyn, Jonathan and Eliza, for lives joined by an improbable thread of fate. The car waited, engine purring, but Charles paused on the front step. "Before you go," he said, "I'd like you to know that we've arranged for temporary housing closer to your new position. A place more suitable for a little girl who deserves a garden to play in." Jonathan opened his mouth to protest, but Charles held up a hand. "Accept it as a token of my thanks," he said, his voice resonant. "This isn't charity. It's a bridge, one you've more than earned." Evelyn stepped closer and reached for his hand. For an instant, she held it in both of hers, and he felt the warmth of her gratitude flow into him like light. "I will never forget what you did," she said, her voice a whisper meant only for him. He cleared his throat and managed a ragged smile. "Then perhaps we've both learned the same thing," he replied, "that you never know which moment of kindness will be the one that saves a life." As they drove away, Eliza's head resting against his shoulder, Jonathan gazed out at the passing streets. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think beyond survival. He pictured a home with a gate that creaked open to welcome them, a kitchen filled with the scent of real suppers, a school where Eliza would never again feel the small shame of being the child who had less. He imagined evenings spent reading to her in a warm lamplight, and the quiet pride of work that was valued, respected. He thought, too, of Clara, of how she would have looked at him with that fierce, clear gaze and said, "I always knew you were capable of this." He felt her presence in every heartbeat. When the car pulled up in front of their building, Jonathan saw neighbors peering through lace curtains, curiosity glinting in every eye. Once, that scrutiny would have embarrassed him. Now, he only felt a humble pride. He helped Eliza down, thanked the driver, and carried the envelope of vouchers inside as though it were the most precious cargo in the world. That evening, he prepared a supper of warm soup and fresh bread with the first groceries he had bought without counting every penny twice. Eliza danced around the kitchen as if she sensed the change that had taken root in their lives. After she ate, she curled up in his lap, her thumb in her mouth, the borrowed storybook pressed against her cheek. "Daddy," she murmured sleepily, "I like today." He kissed the crown of her head, his voice thick. "I like it too, my love." Later, as moonlight spilled across the floorboards, he sat at the little table and began drafting a letter to Charles and Evelyn. He struggled to find words big enough to contain the gratitude that swelled inside him, but all he could write, over and over, was "thank you." As the ink dried, he realized that this was the shape of hope, not a sudden miracle, but the slow, steady return of faith in the goodness of others and in the worth of his own spirit. The next morning dawned clear and blue. He woke early and dressed Eliza in her cleanest clothes. They walked together to the shop one last time to gather his tools, their hands linked. He thought of how every stitch he had ever sewn, every long night he had spent at the workbench, had led them to this moment. Standing in the doorway, he took a long look around the little room. Then he closed the door behind him and stepped into the sun, carrying nothing but a box of well-worn tools, his daughter's small hand, and a heart full of possibilities he had only just begun to imagine.